There's so many kinds of apples that each one has a special quality. They're bred for lots of different reasons, and the best apple that I've eaten is going to be different from the best apple for pressing cider. The cider that I make generally has whatever apples I can get and get for free. So that can be any number of apples, most of which are considered dessert apples. That's another factor with the flavor profile of the cider. But there are apples that are grown specifically for cider. The apples that are in regular orchards, it's very important that they be nice looking, for instance. And actually a cider apple, which are almost always organic because it's not important that they look nice, there's actually certain diseases of apples that cause the tree to really put a lot of effort into keeping their apples alive. So they put all these sugars into those little scrubby apples, because if they don't put all that effort and energy into the apple wouldn't create enough seeds to create another apple tree, which is what an apple is all about. It's all about making more trees and surviving.
You have to twist the apple off. So you grasp it. Well, that one just fell off. But the thing that you don't want to do is you see this thing here? This little bud part?
Yeah.
That'll be next year's apple, so you don't want to rip that off ideally. So
It's okay like this, right?
yes, perfect like that.
So in many ways, the ideal cider apple is a little bit bumpy and wormy and with a little fungus and a little whatever, because that means that the tree really has to work hard to keep that apple alive by putting all its energy and sugar into that little apple. Combine that with, if you're growing apple trees for cider, you pick the varieties that have the right tannins, the right sugars. There's different terms they use for cider. There's sharpness, bitterness, sugars. I'm trying to remember the fourth one, but there's a fourth one. There are these four, but those are the main ones. So it really has to have a balance of acid. It's just like wine. They have to have that balance. And cider, you don't think of cider as that way, but it is very much similar in that regard to wine. Making cider is actually a super simple process. They've been doing it from the beginning of apples. And so all that it really involves, frankly, is crushing the apples. Ideally, you wash them first. Layer them either in a press. There are different types of presses. There are these presses that are layers of straw or hay. Now sometimes they're boards, a kind of board. And then there's a big heavy press that goes down and presses the juice out of the apples. What I use is a different kind of press, a press much closer to a grape press, and that you grind up the apples. It goes into a cylinder, and then there's a weight that then presses on the apples, and the juice comes out the bottom.
Because you get a lot of different flavors, the apples have different flavors, so the cider will be totally different.
The apple juice that comes out of the press, actually in the cider business, that's just called juice. Cider officially is the fermented beverage, and that's the beverage that has alcohol in it. People call cider any apple beverage that's dark brown and that kind of thing, but that's not true. It's not really what it is. It's just apple juice. So the difference comes from the fresh juice that's right out of the apples, and then to make the hard cider, it has to be fermented. And it's also a very simple process. All you really have to do is put the juice in a container that can be sealed, that has an airlock, so that as it starts to ferment, the gases can leave without allowing bacteria to get in and spoil the cider. That cider, some people add certain things like, or take away, some people will add sulfites to kill the natural yeast, so that then they have control over the finished product, the taste of the product. But I only do the natural yeast. So I don't kill off the natural yeast. I let the natural yeast that exists on the apples themselves create the fermentation. It's that yeast that eats the sugars that turns into the alcohol. The basic fermentation process is the same for any cider, but there are different types of cider. what I make is called more or less a farmhouse cider. So it's basically literally what farmers in Europe typically, and in this country too, just make in their backyards. And then there's various types of European ciders. There's a Spanish cider. There's a ice cider, which is made with frozen apples, and that's very sweet. So there are these different types, and also because the juice has these different qualities and different amounts of sugar, you end up with a different percentage of alcohol. They can be as low as, say, 4%, and as high with sugars, apples that are grown specifically for cider, they can be as high as 7 or 8%. So sort of similar to, closer to beer than to wine.
Look at, there's like 3 or 4 in that one. Oh, those are seeds.
Oh, getting all up close.
You having fun?
I'm having so much fun.
And being very helpful?
Trying to. I'm afraid of the bees.
The bees are
Bees
unavoidable.
and the spiders.
Everything, yeah, bees and spiders.
The fermentation process, really active fermentation, takes anywhere, I would say, depending on the weather and how much yeast is in the, completely natural without added yeast. It can take maybe 2 months to, yeah, probably around 2 months in the active part. A little bit more, a little bit less, depending on those factors of temperature and yeast. After that, there is no real shelf life. Because of the alcohol, which is a great preservative, it can last, if it's sealed properly, it can last for quite a long time. The first cider that I made was in 2017, and I've made it every year since then except for last year. Yeah, I made it through COVID. I made it, I mean, it's a great time to do it because you could, all you have to do is be outside picking apples, and the cider process itself is all outside. You can't, I mean, the pressing, making the juice is outside. Fermentation is typically, there's different ways of doing it, but I do it in glass carboys, 5 or 6 gallon glass carboys. I've also done it in other vessels, but that's the easiest way to do it, and that's what most home cider makers do. I used to spend the summers in a town in western Massachusetts that had the most amazing cider festival every year, every fall. And that's when I was first introduced to homemade hard cider. Almost everything in my life I'm self-taught. And so, yeah, I did research. There's a couple great books out there. I went to a few lectures, and there's always the internet. And like I've said before, it's super simple. It's one of the most simple things to make. All it is cider in a jar, basically, that you then wait for for this time period of the fermentation that happens naturally.
We have made the mistake of going to the orchard and picking the biggest, fattest, most awesome apples you could pick, and they don't fit in there, and we have to cut the goddamn things in half.
Actually, the hardest part of making the hard cider is bottling it, which is a real pain in the neck, because you do have to have things fairly sterile. So you have to, sterilize the bottles and properly close them, that type of thing. So that's probably the most time-consuming aspect.
It's a great fun thing.
Can you see the difference from me standing here sweating, swinging that flywheel compared to me standing here holding the trigger on this drill?
One of the sort of tricky parts about home cider making, like I do in the fully natural style, is that you don't have a lot of control over the final product. You have some control, but not total control. There are a lot of different factors, just some as simple as what type of yeast is existing on those apples and how much yeast is on those apples, and varieties of apples, like I mentioned before. But once you press the juice, you then put it in these carboys for that initial fermentation. There is a process, and many people do this thing where it's called racking off the cider. So they then siphon it off and put it into another vessel, leaving behind what's called the lees, which is in effect dead yeast at the bottom of the vessel, the carboy. So then they siphon off the clear juice, it's clear cider at that time, and they put it into another vessel and let it ferment even more. Now that can change the flavor profile of the cider. There's a lot of different things that can change that profile. The variety of the apple, the weather, all kinds of things. So that's just basic cider. There are a lot of other types, like I mentioned before, and a lot of those types, what happens after that basic cider is made impacts the finished product. So you can age cider. And a lot of people, I haven't done this personally, but and I am interested in doing it, but it is to put it into like old whiskey barrels, and then you can age it in these whiskey barrels that then create a different flavor. There are things you can add to cider to change the profile. You can add a different type of fruit juice, So I've made it with wild grape juice. It makes it a beautiful color and gives it just a tiny change in the flavor. I've made it with mulberries, which also gives it a beautiful color and hardly changes the taste, but does make it pretty. There's a kind of cider that's made especially in Vermont, and that is they put a couple raisins in the bottle. What that does is it adds a little bit of sugar. There's almost always a little residual yeast in cider, and that raisin has sugar, and the yeast then has a second go at it, and that causes a little effervescence in the cider. It's like with champagne. That's basically called bottle conditioning. If I were to go to a cider tasting, I would taste, many, many ciders and pick the one that I personally like the taste of. And like with wine, it's pretty similar. There are some that are really funky and kind of cloudy and a little mousy. And a lot of people really love that kind of weird mousy thing, and I really hate it. So I really like a nice, crisp, clean, totally dry cider. And that means that you ferment it all the way. You ferment it till there's not a single bubble left in it. Some people who like a little bit of a semi-dry, they'll stop the fermentation before it's fully dried. Cider is sort of a simple person's beverage. It used to be that, especially in New England, where they made a lot of cider, that it was the beverage that everybody drank because the water wasn't good and it wasn't trustworthy. And cider, with its little 4 to 5% alcohol, was a very safe beverage. It was the primary beverage in this country until Prohibition. And at Prohibition, all of that stopped. And then, of course, there were backyard stills, and people still did it, but it really changed the focus. And after that, beer became much more common. So because everybody drank it, it's almost like it works with any food. Just like you can have beer with any food, really. But these days, I think in general, when people think of cider as a beverage, I think it's still, once again, kind of a more similar to beer than to wine. So any food that would go with beer would go with cider also. And yet, because it's sort of a classically New England, although the people in the West Coast would disagree with that, but then, things like a beautiful Vermont cheddar or, it's sort of similar. I think because it's such a simple alcoholic beverage to make, that it's kind of fun. It's a little like science, and I like science. And it's a little like cooking, and I like cooking. And it's a lot like gardening, and I like gardening. So I think it was a natural interest for me. Combine that with the Franklin County Cider Days, and also the house in Massachusetts where I used to take the children was in an old apple orchard. And there were tons of apples, and it just felt like there were apples all over the ground. and they would just rot there. And so it just seemed to make sense to do something with them. And that's still the case. People have, up here in Vermont and in Massachusetts, they have these backyard apple trees that they can almost never use all the apples.
The cider house rules.
So it's a great way to connect with people, to use some of those apples, and it's free. You know, it's like free booze. All it is your time, and you know, it was something that I was really interested in, and it turned out that my brother was also really interested in it.
I should go hunting this afternoon. I'll smell like a dinner plate for them deer.
Jumping out of the woods to get
Just
you.
come running. Smells like apples over here. Oh wait, that's an arrow.
So we decided to buy this press and make cider. And so he's been my partner in crime making the cider since the beginning. He sort of had enough of it, but he does it anyway for me. It's fun. It's science and it's fun. That's probably what mostly drew me to it. That and, you know, it's great to drink.
When you throw apples in so fast that the bees just get sucked in the hopper, you know you're throwing apples in.
My name is Coco Dupont, and making cider in the fall in Vermont is my favorite activity.